Wes, it's good to see you as always, my friend.
It's good to see you too, Rob.
Wes, we've got something a little bit different on tap today. I think our listeners are really going to enjoy it. We have received several questions that folks have just written in. Some of these people are just listeners throughout the country. Some are staff of Nets in the local church here. Some of them are residents, and maybe we've got a couple from family.
Are any questions about increased pay from the staff?
That's mostly what they're about.
Okay.
We'll get to that for sure.
All right.
Yeah.
We may have to be very diplomatic with those questions, Rob.
Absolutely. Some of these are theological in nature. Some of them are personal. Some of them are quite practical. It's good stuff. What do you think about we just jump into it?
Sounds like fun.
All right, let's do it. So I'm going to read these questions just as they came in, Wes. So this first question, 1 Thessalonians 5:2 states that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. And in Matthew 24:36, it states, but concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father's only. If we are told Jesus is to return without warning, why do you think some tend to get caught up in looking for the signs of his return?
That's a good question, Rob. I think we're all hardwired to know. We want to know about things, and we don't like uncertainty. So even when it's crystal clear that this is not something we're to know, we still crave knowing. And I think that's driven by a misperception that we can't feel secure about our lives unless we know. So we've really got a false basis of security that's driving this really ungodly pursuit because God has made it clear we don't know. Not even the Son knows. So we just have to accept that's not one of the things we need to know. We got ourselves in trouble back in the Garden of Eden because we wanted to know, and Satan tempted us on that basis, and we partook because we wanted to know good and evil. We always get into trouble when we pursue knowledge that God doesn't want for us. And we have to recalibrate and say our security is not based on knowing certain things. It's based on knowing the right person. And if we know the right person who knows these certain things, we can relax. We don't have to pursue that. I think that's the main reason. I think another reason is, even though the Word says we're not to know that, sometimes people think they can solve it like a jigsaw puzzle and put this together. And it's, no, we've got enough information here. Let's just put the pieces together. And again, there is a lot of information, but it's all under the banner of we don't know. And we got to just live in that tension.
Thank you for answering that. And thank you for the question. Hopefully the person that asked that is listening. All right, here's the next question, Wes. What's the most important thing to look for when you're searching for a new church in a new area? What are your non-negotiables?
That's a question that I haven't had to face, really, because of being a pastor for so many years. We were settled on that church. We weren't looking too much for other churches. That's a joke. I think the first and foremost is you're looking for gospel preaching that is grounded in good scriptural exegesis. And I qualify it that way, Rob, because I think there's churches that preach the gospel, and they preach the gospel faithfully, but their exposition, their exegesis is a little sketchy. And the problem with that is, even though they're right on today, they may not be right on tomorrow because they don't have proper guardrails up to make sure they're really preaching the text that they have instead of flying above the text. So I'd want to find a church that preaches Scripture, preaches the gospel, but does it with good exegetical precision in the way that they do that. So I'd be looking for that. I'd be looking for a church where, after a little investigation, it's clear that they love one another, because that's the test as to whether or not there's real faith. And then I'd be looking for a church where they're clear regarding broad leadership structures. I'd want a church where they're clear that men are to be the leaders, to be the elders. But I'd want to see a leadership structure that very much was integrated with the congregation. So there was real congregational participation, input. Leaders are listening. And that comes in a lot of different varieties. There's not just one ecclesiology that does that. So those would be three things that I would start with. And then, of course, if they had racquetball courts, that'd be a bonus. I guess I should say today, pickleball courts.
Yeah, pickleball courts, you're going to find a lot more. I don't even know if you could find a racquetball court.
That's right. I'm dating myself.
What about salvation paradigm? How do you go about understanding that about a church? It's not a straightforward question to ask a minister or ask the elders. How do you maybe uncover where they're at with their salvation paradigm, their construct of salvation?
Yeah, I do think that's trickier, and I think you could attempt to have some interviews with the key staff, with the senior pastor does that sort of thing. I think it's always helpful to ask their view of Romans 7. Now, that may seem a little, maybe that seems a little too reductionistic, but that will help you to understand what they think happens when somebody comes to Christ. You'll get some idea there without judging. It just will give you a good indication. But that's not probably going to come out. You're not going to see that on the website. You're not going to hear that in the sermon necessarily, unless you happen to hit a sermon and the pastor is actually challenging those who have professed Christ to be sure that they've actually possessed Christ by true faith. But that would be an anomaly. I don't think you tend to hear that on any given Sunday.
Yes, good segue. Our next question actually here is on Romans 7. I've got a few of them from a listener, and I'm just going to read them just as they're written here. Wes, if Paul is writing about his experience as an unbeliever in Romans 7, 13 to 25, why does he use the present tense? Paul uses the past tense earlier in Romans 7 and in other sections of his letters and in his dialogue recorded in Acts. Why would he have chosen to use what seems like a present tense in English to speak about the past?
Yeah. I would refer this listener to a New American Standard Bible, not because I think it's the best translation, although I do, but because I think if they read the Gospels, what they would see that's uniquely in the New American Standard Bible are asterisks. There's asterisks that mark verses that have been changed from present tense to past tense. And they've done that because in English, we would put all that in past tense. And these are verbs that are clearly in the present tense, but they're clearly talking about past tense scenarios. And I'm trying to look for the note. Here it is. In the prelude, Introduction to a New American Standard Bible, here's what it says. It says, asterisks are used to mark verbs that are historical presents in the Greek, which have been translated with an English past tense in order to conform to modern usage. The translators recognize that in some contexts, the present tense seems more unexpected and unjustified to the English reader than a past tense would have been. But Greek authors, here's the salient point, Greek authors frequently use the present tense for the sake of heightened vividness, thereby transporting their readers in imagination to the actual scene at the time of occurrence. However, the translators felt that it would be wise to change these historical presents to English past tense. That's in the front of every New American Standard Bible. And they asterisk those verbs. And if you look at the Gospels, there's asterisks everywhere. In other words, they are changing these present tense verbs, which are used to vivify the narrative, like you are there, all over the place to past tense. So really the question is, why didn't they do that in Romans 7? That's really the question. Not that there's any tension with Paul describing a past event. Why didn't the translators make the same decision that they've made all over the Gospels to Romans 7? And it's because Romans 7 has traditionally been translated and interpreted as a believer. But if I was doing the translation, I would have translated those all to the past tense because readers read that. It's controversial. They think it must be Paul's present life because it's in the present tense. I would say these are all historical present tenses, which were not changed to the past tense like the other verbs in the Gospels. Does that make sense, Rob?
It does. That's very interesting. I wouldn't expect that's where you would have went with that. And I'm sure our listeners finding this very interesting, the one who wrote in. He's got a follow-up here. Could the enslavement to sin that Paul is talking about in Romans 7 be different in its essence, but similar in its experience to the enslavement to sin that Christians have been freed from? He references here Romans 6:14. Could the enslavement that Paul is speaking about in Romans 7 be a temporary and voluntary submission to our former slave master that no longer owns us?
That is how folk who take Romans 7 as a believer, that is how they would take it, that it's a temporary situation that you go in and out of. The problem that I have with that is that everything else in Romans 6, the first part of 7 in Romans 8, is not talking about some sort of an existential change in status from slave to sin to slave to righteousness. This is a once-for-all, no-looking-back change. So we are not just slaves to righteousness some of the time. That's been an ontological change. We're now slaves to righteousness. We were slaves to sin. We're now slaves to righteousness. We were in the flesh. We're now in the Spirit. Being in the Spirit isn't an experiential, existential reality, and we can flip back and forth. No, Romans 8 says, you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit if the Spirit of God dwells within you. So these things that are being described, in fact, let me read at the end of Romans 6 here. He says, for when you were slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness. Okay, when I was a slave to sin, I was free in regard to righteousness. Therefore, what benefit were you then deriving from the things of which you're now ashamed? For the outcome of those things is death. But now, having been freed from sin and enslaved to God, you derive your benefit, resulting in sanctification and the outcome eternal life. See, this is talking about two states. Here's what you were, and now here's what you are. And the guy in Romans 7 is still enslaved to his sin. He's still in that category. We're not talking about experiential day-by-day statuses. We're talking about lost and saved. And just like you're not saved, but sometimes you're lost, so too you are not a slave to righteousness, but sometimes a slave to sin. That's not what we're talking about.
In almost a follow-up to what you're saying from this listener, if a temporary submission to sin wasn't possible for a Christian to engage in, why would Paul warn believers to let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body to make you obey its passions? That's coming out of Romans 6:12. And stand firm therefore and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery, Galatians 5:1.
Yes. In the Galatians 5 passage, it's because they have very likely put themselves under the law. They have put themselves under a yoke of slavery. But it's important to note that in that same book, they're also being warned that perhaps they're lost. So this is just talking about a normal Christian experience that, okay, I've temporarily put myself under a yoke of slavery. These guys were right on the cusp of putting themselves under the law for salvation. They were on the cusp of embracing a justification by law system. So that would have been what constituted them being under the yoke of slavery. You see what I'm saying? It's not just I sin today. It's that I'm rejecting the grace gospel and I'm embracing a works gospel, the law-based gospel. I think Romans 6 is simply saying, here's the reality, but even though sin's presence has not been vanquished, you are no longer a slave to it, but you can not become a slave to it again, but you can certainly offer your members as instruments of unrighteousness. But that's different from the state of going back to slavery to sin. So yeah, the struggle with sin is still true, but because we're no longer a slave to sin, we now can offer ourselves as instruments of righteousness. But sin is still present, so I do need to be on guard. But it's not enslavement that I need to be on guard against. That's not the problem anymore.
Thank you, Wes. That's good. All right, this is really switching gears here, but that's what I think is fun about this particular episode. Is it wrong to think about marketing strategies for the church similarly to a business?
Wow, from Romans 7 to marketing strategies.
That's right. Our listeners are on their toes.
We're covering the whole gamut. The dirty word that you said there, Rob, do you know what it was?
Marketing?
No.
Business?
Yes, marketing might be the second dirty word, but business is the bad
for sure.
boy.
Yeah.
Yeah, business. I think, first of all, we got to step back and not get lost in those words yet and recognize that the church is both an organism, we're a family, but it's also an organization. And we deny that second reality to our own peril. It's an organization. Churches have to have accounting functions. Churches have to have computer, IT functions. Churches have to have personnel policies. Churches have to have the whole compensation requirements. They have to follow the law in all those things. Oftentimes they have to have facilities, managers, building and grounds, all the same things that all the other organizations in the world have to have. Churches have to have those basic kinds of things. So churches do advertise. Now, there's probably ways to do that are not godly, and we don't want to partake of that. But we don't want to just paint all advertising, all marketing with one broad brushstroke. We want to get the word out. In fact, I'd say it this way, Rob. If there's ever an organization that has something to advertise, it's the organization that's promising resurrection from the dead. Who can beat that? Now, we don't want to do it in a crass kind of a way. We want to do it in a godly way. But my goodness, why wouldn't you want to advertise or market that? We're in the business of saving souls, and we want people to know that the water of life is here. Here it is. Come and get it.
Excellent. Okay, so here's another question, Wes. The pastor's family sacrifices so that he may pastor his congregation well. How do you know when your family is sacrificing too much?
I don't think it's ever an issue of too much. I think it's an issue of at the expense of what. I don't think the amount of sacrifice is the question. I think it's what's being neglected in the name of that sacrifice that's the question. So the key word for Sue and me is the word connection. I'm sure our listeners have an appreciation for the fact that I'm a worker. In modern parlance, I'd be called a workaholic. Why wasn't that a problem for our family? Because however much I worked, we were committed, and my wife was very helpful in holding my feet to the fire. We were committed to a vibrant and robust connection, not just with each other, but with our kids. Now, that doesn't mean we attended every kids event. It doesn't mean that we were members of the PTA or PTO or whatever it's called today, but it does mean that we were engaged in their lives at an intimate level. And they knew that we were there for them, and they knew that we were interested in their interests, even if they weren't necessarily interests that we had. So I think the operative word is connection. And the question is, are you vitally connected to your family? And if you are, I think you can be as busy as you like. And I understand there's only 168 hours in a week, but I'm absolutely convinced that nobody's watching the clock in the family. But what they are watching is, are we connected to one another? Do we care for one another? Do we love one another? And that's always been the barometer that Sue and I used to try to test that question.
I'm really struggling with this episode. I normally get to ask the follow-ups, but these people all over are asking the follow-ups.
Well, you could insert one if you wanted to.
I might. You wouldn't know any different.
You're a listener.
I am a listener. All right, here's a good one. What responsibility does a pastor have to engage with other churches, pastors in the area? Should they seek opportunities to do joint ventures with like-minded churches?
I think broadly, generally, yes. And I think that it's a better witness to the world at large if they see that the churches aren't competing with one another. For years, we hosted a ministerium where once a month, as many local pastors as wanted got together for a luncheon that Christ Memorial supplied. And of all stripes, we had all sorts of different folks. We had a Lutheran minister who would come with collar, but we were all confessing the same Christ. So I think it speaks to the unity that Jesus prayed for in his high priestly prayer the night before he died, that we might be one. So yeah, I think the more the merrier.
Do you recommend when your residents go out and plant a church that they go ahead and connect with those pastors in their area?
Absolutely, absolutely. And here's one major reason. We want to make it clear, we're not coming out to steal sheep. We're coming to try to see a net gain to the kingdom, and we're coming appreciative of the groundwork you've already laid. We're not coming in thinking, hey, we know the right way to do it, and our advertising stick is not, come to our church. This will be a real experience. No, we don't want to be saying that kind of stuff. That's arrogant. That's disunifying. There's all kinds of things that are wrong with that. So yeah, that's what I did when I moved to Burlington, and all of our guys have done that when they've gone out.
Here's another one, Wes. What qualities would you be looking for when hiring your first associate pastor? Would those qualities be different if you're hoping he'll be a church planter someday?
Yes, they would be different if you were hoping that he was going to be a lead pastor, a church planter. Yes, it would be different.
How about you're hiring your first associate pastor, you're a church plant. By God's grace, things have been going fantastic. You're at year 3, 4, 5. It's time to hire an associate. What are you looking for?
Yeah, I think you're looking for a fella that's comfortable executing orders, that doesn't feel like he's got to be in the lead position, faithful, skilled, talented, but not vying for the lead chair. That creates all kinds of problems. And on the other hand, if you're hiring a guy that you hope will transition from that to a church planter or a lead pastor, then you got to be willing to put up with some stuff, because you want a guy that's maybe a little restless, pushy, maybe without thinking about it grabs the lead. He's got ideas, and he's pushing his ideas. You've got to just decide that's what you want. You got to have a guy that's got that entrepreneurial mindset, because he's going to have to go out there and try to create something out of nothing, depending on the nature of the plant. So that's not the ideal associate, but you're willing to go along with that because you see that he's got the requisite bents that he's going to need when he gets out there.
Do you think there's a real advantage to putting up with that because you want to bring a lead guy in as an associate for a bit before you send him out?
I do, because that candidate still needs to learn to follow orders. I've heard someone say you can't be in the lead position if you haven't been willing to follow a leader, but it's not his go-to gear. So you're going to just have to accept that's not his go-to gear. But yeah, he needs to have a team concept, because when he gets out there, even though he's the lead guy, he's got to work with his team, and they're going to have different ideas, and he can't just blow them off. He's got to be willing to listen to those ideas and have a genuine collaborative kind of spirit, even though he's the lead dog.
All right, Wes, here's our next question. If you were planting Christ Memorial Church all over again, what would you do differently? That's a big one. You're going to have to deduce that to a thought.
I think that I would work the theology of prayer more carefully, because where I've come to now is a much deeper conviction, a more heartfelt conviction about the importance of prayer. I didn't have that when I planted Christ Memorial Church. I thought prayer was important just like the next guy, but to try to create a culture that was fervent in prayer, not just dutiful in prayer. I think we have a very dutiful culture, but I think I failed as a leader because I wasn't clear in my own mind as to what is necessary to facilitate fervency in prayer. That's the biggest one that stands out to me.
That's good. All right. How can a pastor's wife be most helpful to her husband during the pastorate?
Gosh, no. It's hard for me to get objective on this because all I do is think about all the wonderful things Sue did for me and how helpful they all were. And maybe that's not a bad place to start. I think not being afraid to be honest with his leadership and his preaching. There's a story about Winston Churchill, and we know this is true because we have the letter that his wife's name was Clementine. Clemmy, he called her. And when he became the prime minister right on the cusp of World War II, he already had a reputation for being mercurial. He could get cross. And she wrote him this lovely letter. I've heard the letter read, saying that she's become concerned that his staff and those he's working with might not know him to be the kind person that she knew him to be, that he'd become sharp and impatient, that he was in danger of alienating his staff. And she called him to come away from that. I just thought it was such a majestic letter that she wrote, so well done, but she held his feet to the fire. Can you imagine holding Winston Churchill's feet to the fire? So I think a wife needs to be honest, not in a critical, disapproving way, but in a way that helps him better understand how he's coming across to people, how he's treating people, how his preaching is coming across. We'd drive home from church sometimes and Sue would say, "When you said this, I winced a little bit." And I'm like, okay, I know wincing isn't good. I'm really sure that's a bad thing. Not wincing because she felt convicted, just I wish you wouldn't have said that.
How's that going to land?
How's that going to land? So I think honesty in terms of how he's managing the family, feedback on how he's doing as a father. And I know you could say the pastor's going to get under the pile on that and feel guilty. He's in the wrong profession if that's what he's worried about. This is not a profession for faint of heart. You've got to thicken up your skin and be willing to take godly feedback from the person that cares the most about you. So that would probably be a real big thing. I think another thing is she can just like her husband, like his preaching, just like him, and like his church. One of the best things Sue did is she liked our church. And she knew it wasn't perfect because she knew the guy that was in charge. She knew the lead pastor wasn't perfect, but she liked our church, which meant she accepted a lot of different types of people. So I think really liking the church is so valuable for the church and for the kids.
Yeah, a fan of the church, a fan of the pastor, a fan of the people.
Yeah. Without being rose-colored glasses. She was never rose-colored glasses, not with me, but she still liked me.
But it's a decision. It's a
decision.
I'm going to like this.
That's right. That's right. And by the way, we can choose to do that with everybody. We can choose to set our affections on whomever we want. we have that freedom in Christ.
A bit of a follow-up to that question is, what healthy expectation should a pastor's wife have about the realities of ministry life?
Yeah, that's a great question. The pastor is not your 9-to-5 man. He doesn't have weekends off, and he's on call 24/7. And I think the wife makes a decision when a couple goes into the pastorate that she's sharing her husband with the congregation. So she can't be petty, she can't be insecure, she can't be jealous, and she's doing that because she believes that's best for the kingdom of God. She's willingly restricting something that she, at least in theory, likes, which is spend more time with her husband and have him spend more time with the family in order to be a blessing to other people. It's the ultimate in loving your neighbor as yourself. And so I think a wife has to be clear. That's an occupational hazard of the job, which is actually a blessing. She's losing her life so that the church might have life.
Would a pastor's wife grow into that role, or do they need to know that up front? What do you see with the different couples that you
I
work
think
with?
it's both. You certainly need to have some level of awareness up front so you don't get shocked. But no doubt, everybody's growing into their role, including the pastor's wife, and that would be part of the growth. And it looks different at different phases with the kids. You just have to recognize that there's a certain dynamism to it, and it's going to look a little different at different stages. But it's the same basic gene. I'm willing to open my hands with my husband.
All right, Wes, we're going to get a little personal.
All right?
I'll start off really carefully.
Okay.
What's your favorite song to play on the trumpet?
Oh, my favorite song. Actually, I don't have a favorite song, but my favorite thing to do with the trumpet is put something on. I still use CDs. Put something on and just improvise to it. That's a lot of fun for me.
Like riffing, is that what
Yeah, that'd be a way to say it. And it kind of keeps me sharp. I have to work with the different keys and work with some of the ones I'm not as comfortable improvising in. So that would be my favorite thing.
Cool. Other than Sue and your own family, who do you feel closest to?
Oh, boy.
I told you we're going to get a little personal.
Yeah, boy, that's really a hard one because I've worked very hard to be impartial. I've never wanted there to be any perception that this is my best friend or that's my best friend. And so I've lived by the creed that I'm going to be impartial, and that even though I know some people quite well, and there are some people that I can let my hair down with, I worked very hard not to in any way present that to the congregation. And so maybe in the spirit of that, I'd rather not say. But there are some people that I've known for a long time that if I wasn't in this role, we'd be best friends. I have no doubt.
I'll follow up with that, pivot a little bit. Can you share maybe a mentor or two that you might have or have
Sure.
had in your life?
Yes. There are a few that come to mind. The fellow that led me to Christ, his name was Phil Smith, was a significant mentor for me. There was a fellow named Denny Stokes, who was a Navigator representative. He was actually a very significant mentor for me. The pastor that married us, there was actually two. They both were mentors, but particularly Dale Burke was a significant mentor for me and still is on our advisory board with Nets. And then there was a fellow named George Hill. George was a bit of a surrogate father to me. He picked me up when I was about 22 years old and worked with me for the next 35 years until I actually officiated at his funeral. And he really took a deep interest in me. And I loved him as a father because I really didn't have a father figure in my life. So those are some of the mentors that have meant the most to me.
That's good. Thanks for sharing that. Can you talk about how the Lord comforted you during the most difficult times of your life?
Wow.
These are good questions, Wes.
No holds
I'm
barred
going to lose
here.
my job.
Yeah. I think the main comfort, and I could relate this to several of the more difficult things that I keep coming back to, is that in Hebrews 12, it says that he disciplines those whom he loves. And the reason that's significant is because I'm a justice guy. So if I think I'm getting a raw deal, I can cry foul with the best of them. But the question is, who's really dealing the cards? Whose hand is this from? And even if there's clear sin in the dealing from a human point of view, I can't get over my own belief in the sovereignty of God and the belief that he is a loving heavenly Father and that even the Son learned obedience through the things he suffered. And if Jesus needed to suffer in order to learn obedience, whatever that all means, you go through those hard times, I keep coming back. This is God's perfect, customized will for my life, no matter how distasteful it is, or no matter how much it hurts. And because He is our sovereign, loving Heavenly Father, we can rest in even the most deepest distress. As the old hymn says, He sanctifies to us our deepest distress. And I come back to that idea over and over again. It's a little bit like Jesus loves me, this I know. Okay, I'm back to the basics. The Father loves me, this I know, and He has ordained these things to purify my faith, to make me like His Son. And it's what's needed. He's not messed up. He hasn't forgotten about me. This is exactly what I need to be fit for heaven.
Does that take the edge off for you? Is it just as painful? With what you're going through at the time, is it going to be just as painful, but you know that, so it's comforting? Or does it take some of that pain away?
Yeah, I think it takes the edge off. At least if it doesn't take the edge off, it allows you to rest in the midst of it. You're not churning. I think the biggest edge is the emotional edge of feeling mistreated or feeling uncared for or whatever it is. So, yeah, He's got me in the hollow of His hand. This is what He's ordained for me, and He knows exactly what I'm going through, so I can go to Him casting all my care upon Him because He cares for me, and it just turns the corner so that I'm not churning about it.
Have you considered writing your autobiography? It would be a bestseller among those who know and love you.
Sure. I guess you could say that of any father or pastor of a church for a long time. The answer is no. I think you got to be someone really special to be writing your own autobiography, like a president or someone like that. No, I really haven't. But my wife has threatened, and what she'll do if I pass before she does, I can't control. But she's just sneaky enough that she might try to do something like that. But I wouldn't advise it.
All right, here's one. What makes you most excited as you look to the next 10 years of Nets?
Oh, that's a great question, Rob. I think what most excites me is the idea that we have a never-ending queue line of qualified guys that not only are being sent out from Christ Memorial Church and then Christ Transformation Church, the new church plant that I'm going to be a part of, but that are being connected with other churches throughout New England, starting with the Nets churches, as church planting residents in their churches that they're sending out as well. And that we've just got the numbers and they're going and we're training them. We're building on their seminary education. I like to say it this way, that they love only God, they hate only sin, and they preach only Christ. So we're sending these guys out, peppering the landscape, and by God's grace, causing gospel tinder to be so plenteous that if God is willing to light that match of revival, it combusts. And you've got a third great awakening. But we can't control that. But by God's grace, we can, if He's pleased to bless us, just litter the landscape with men that love the gospel.
All right, how would you describe the relationship between God's will and our prayer? Is our prayer able to bend God's good pleasure if it aligns with His will? An example would be prayer that God would give salvation to someone close to us.
No, you can't bend God's will. And of course, based on our last podcast, Rob, when we talked about Calvinism with a smile, the Lord has determined who will be saved. It's a number that no man can count. But Jesus said things like this, all that the Father has given to me shall come to me, and I will in no wise cast them out. Of all the Father has given to me, he says later in John 6, His will is that I lose nothing. So there is a set number, and our prayers don't alter that number. So I think that's an unhelpful doctrine. Any rejection of the doctrine of election is unhelpful because certain things have already been determined. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't pray fervently for people to be saved, because this is way above our pay grade. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, Deuteronomy 29:29 says. I don't know who He's chosen and who He's not, but I do know that He answers prayer, and I do know that He has the power to change a sinner into a saint. So I'm going to pray and leave all that to Him. But I don't think we should believe that we can alter His will in that regard.
What about outside of salvation? What about prayer for other things? That has an effect. We're told to pray. We're told to pray fervently. Why pray if we can't affect God's will?
Yeah, and as the scriptures say, you have not because you ask not.
Yes.
That's a very good question. I'm not sure I can answer that satisfactorily, but even the impetus to pray is not self-generated. So I have a hard time believing that God's will hasn't been determined. I mean, it says all of our days were numbered before we had one. So let's just take an example. Hezekiah, God told him, get your house in order, you're going to die. And Hezekiah prays, and he prays 3 times. That's an important number because there's a figurative resurrection going on here. And he asks God to spare his life, and God gives him 15 years more. You know that story. Now the question is, did God change his mind ultimately? Obviously, he changed his mind phenomenologically, but did he change his mind in terms of actual ontological reality? And I'd say no. The impetus to pray was from God, and God then answered that prayer. That doesn't mean it wasn't a real prayer, or somehow it was reducing Hezekiah to some automaton. We're not saying that. But God didn't just change his will there. His will was for Hezekiah to live 15 more years. And that's how it worked itself out. Because remember, God is developing our faith. And so part of that is compelling us, inspiring us, stimulating us to pray for certain things. It all sounds like it's just fixed. There's a sense in which it is. He's God. Nothing's happening in the universe that's contingent. It's all his working. But he does it in such a way that builds our faith, doesn't violate our free will. I can't put all that together, but big surprise. I'm a sinful little dirtball. I can't put it all together. Wow, I'm shocked. This is God. His ways are above our ways, as high as the heavens are above the earth. We bow to him. But I would say we're not altering reality with our prayers, but we are fulfilling his will with our prayers.
And is that the main reason we should be praying, because we're fulfilling his will?
Yes.
Because we're told to pray?
Yes, and because it's cultivating the right orientation to the God of heaven. We're developing dependence. See, that's what happened. What happened in the Garden of Eden? We went independent. We went rogue. And all of salvation is attempting to reestablish the right relationship between God and creation. And for us, it's a relationship of utter and constant dependency, and prayer facilitates that.
Wes, we've got several more questions. We're out of time for this episode, but I'd like to just keep this going for our next episode. Are you up for that?
You were asking all the questions. I'm just wondering what your favorite color is, Rob, if I could ask a question.
It's green.
Okay, good. That's a good segue.
Thanks, Wes.
You're welcome, Rob.
To learn more about the Net Center for Church Planning and Revitalization's training and sending programs, visit us online at thenetcenter.org. For questions or comments, email us at pastorpastor@thenetcenter.org. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and consider sharing this episode with a friend. This podcast is a production of the Net Center for Church Planning and Revitalization. Nets, for the life of the church.